Her body was securely entombed in the encasement of that waterbed.
These crime scene photos were later released. You can see Maddie's feet peeking out of the bed, her socks still on.
Emotions have run high today in the resentencing of Nehemiah Griego, who killed his parents and 3 little siblings when he was just 15. He's now looking at 3 consecutive life sentences.
Moments after entering the courtroom, Ohio school shooter T.J. Lane took off his shirt. Underneath was a T-shirt with the word killer handwritten on it.
Teenagers often rebel by coloring their hair, getting tattoos, or drinking alcohol. However, the 10 teens in this video committed severe crimes, leading to life-altering convictions.
Tonight, the sister of this 8-year-old girl killed by her then teenage neighbor in one of Jacksonville's biggest murder cases. Well, her sister says she is sick, thinking that her sister's killer could possibly walk free one day.
Murder is not a crime that one would expect from a child, gruesome murder especially. And that is why, to this day, it is both shocking and sad to hear the story of Joshua Phillips. It was a day like any other in Duval County until it wasn't. An 8-year-old girl, Maddie Clifton, was mistakenly hit by a baseball and would not stop crying. Her cries scared 14-year-old neighbor Joshua Phillips, with whom she had been playing, and in fear that her crying would attract the attention of people around and get him in trouble with his father, who was reportedly mistreating him and would punish him for having friends in the house. The young teenager did the unimaginable. What Joshua Phillips did to avoid getting into trouble with his father will go down in history as one of the most brutal crimes committed in Jacksonville, Florida. In November 1998, the entire neighborhood and the police set out to search for its young member. Everyone, including Joshua Phillips' mother, began handing out flyers of the missing child to people, asking if they'd seen her. While the search party was still out there looking for the little girl, Joshua Phillips' mother made a shocking, gory discovery. Under her teenage son's waterbed was the lifeless body of the missing Maddie Clifton. It turns out that Joshua Phillips had, in a bid to stop Maddie from crying, dragged her into the house he lived in with his parents, hit her repeatedly with a baseball bat until he thought she was dead. When he finished, he then hid her body under his waterbed. His dad returned from work and Joshua was terrified to discover that Maddie was still breathing and moaning. He then stabbed her multiple times until she died. It wasn't until a week after Joshua had killed Maddie that Joshua's mother found the missing body and alerted the authorities. The murder of that little girl was traumatizing for everyone involved. Both the families of the girl who was murdered and the teenager who had committed the crime were distraught. The court initially sentenced Phillips to life imprisonment without parole. But in 2005, the Supreme Court ruled that it is unconstitutional to sentence a child to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. State laws required that another hearing be conducted after 25 years to reassess the situation and see whether or not a person who is convicted as a child is fit to rejoin society. This is required for all juvenile convictions involving death.
It eroded our marriage, replaced love with grief, deep sadness, and a pain that no family should ever have to bear.
At the resentencing, the family of the deceased, her mother, father, and sister all came to testify against Phillips.
Why should the defendant be allowed to live normally while Maddie lies cold in a grave?
The state of Phillips' mind is not certain as he watches the court proceeding, blinking repeatedly, his face expressionless. The late Maddie's mother then goes on to say that if her daughter's murderer was ever released from jail, she hoped she'd no longer be on earth. Reports held that Phillips has been of good behavior in prison, has won multiple awards, and became a Buddhist monk. He also hopes to live in a monastery for the rest of his life if he gets out of jail. Reports also confirmed that Phillips is indeed sorry for his actions. The family of the deceased did not appear to care about that as they insisted that their daughter and sister's murderer should not be allowed to live freely, stating that Joshua hadn't just deprived their daughter of her right to live and them of the joy of watching her grow, but also that her death had put a strain on their marriage. Despite the evidence of good behavior on Josh's part, the judge upheld the original sentence of the court. Joshua will remain in jail for the rest of his life. One might find the conviction of Joshua Phillips to be harsh since he committed these crimes as a young teenager, but wait until you hear the story of Kenneth Young. Young was given consecutive life sentences for a crime he committed at the age of 14.
It was like, with Mr. Young, you're not going home no more, you're gonna die in prison. I'm like, who gonna die? I ain't dying in prison. So I was in denial of that because it happened so fast. It's just like, one day I'm 15 years old and I'm in society, then the next I'm out and you telling me I ain't gonna never go home? That's kind of like hard to deal with.
Kenneth Young was just 14 years old when he was coerced into joining an armed robbery gang, founded by his mother's substance dealer, who was at the time 24 years old. He had participated in a series of armed robberies with the gang, and one other that was unsuccessful before they were apprehended by police. The prosecutor charged Kenneth Young and the rest of the gang with armed robbery and attempted armed robbery. Young was given consecutive life sentences without the option of parole, despite his young age and the circumstances surrounding the crime he'd committed. Firstly, there was no murder, and secondly, Young participated in these criminal activities alongside adults who should have known better and shouldn't have forced him to participate. Kenneth had also reportedly dissuaded his mother's substance dealer and fellow gang member from committing the crime of while they were on a robbery mission. Just as with Joshua Phillips, fortune smiled on Kenneth Young when the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in Graham v. Florida that it was unconstitutional to sentence a child to life imprisonment without parole for a crime that did not result in the death of any person. A documentary on children in prison, 15 to Life, featured Kenneth Young and his struggle as an adult who went to jail as a child was discussed. The point of the documentary was to educate the world on how the system convicts children, especially colored children, leaving them to grow old and rot in prison. The documentary stressed that children who committed crimes when they were none the wiser should be given a second chance.
Sometimes mama lock me and my sister in a room and she just be gone.
In most cases where a teenager or a child is involved in a criminal act, there is an adult who is either neglectful, indulgent, or abusive. In the case of Kenneth Young, his mother was neglectful. Kenneth Young's mother, a former substance addict, held herself responsible for how her son turned out and expressed that she prayed for forgiveness and hoped that her son can get a second chance. She also said that her son has been very instrumental in her journey towards ending her addiction. When he found out about his sentence, Kenneth says he was in denial because it all happened so fast. Despite being astonished by his lengthy sentence, Young showed remorse for his actions. One may blame Kenneth's mother for her negligence and letting her dealer around her teenage son. But what Nehemiah Griego did to his parents and siblings leaves room for even more questions about his parents' parenting.
Emotions have run high today in the resentencing of Nehemiah Griego, who killed his parents and 3 little siblings when he was just 15. He's now looking at 3 consecutive life sentences.
As a 15-year-old boy, young Griego ended the lives of 5 people. The horrifying part? These people were members of his family. That's right. The teenager murdered his parents and 3 of his siblings, aged 9, 5, and 2. Griego shot his mother first, and when confronted by his little brother, who had been asleep by her side, he shot him too. The young teenager then went to his already distraught sister's bedroom and shot them too. After killing his mother and 3 of his siblings, he waited for his father to return home from work and shot him dead too. Griego then lied to his girlfriend that his parents had been killed in an accident and drove to church, where he told his pastor and a member of the church the same lie. The church member, who was a retired homicide detective, however, suspected that something was wrong and immediately alerted the police. Griego confessed to killing his family, stating that he'd been having suicidal and homicidal thoughts, and then mentioned that his mother had angered him earlier and that he was just frustrated with his mother.
If he is released, I believe he will do harm to himself or others. One predominant reason he had mentioned multiple times to both my sister Vanessa and I was that he had been hearing voices since he was 12 years old, telling him to kill.
She assured the court that his action was not a reaction to mistreatment. His uncle admits that the actions of his nephew have caused his family pain, but he believes that Griego should be given a second chance. At first, a judge sentenced him as a juvenile, and he was taken to a juvenile facility where he stayed until he clocked 21. After he officially became an adult, the Attorney General argued that Griego had not been rehabilitated and as such may still pose a danger to society. The court agreed and sentenced him to life imprisonment with the probability of parole, paying no attention to Griego's attorney, who stated that sentencing Griego to jail for life was a cruel and unusual punishment. The state's attorney reminded the court that the fact that Griego could murder 5 members of his own family reflects just how detached, callous, and brutal he is capable of being.
The now 22-year-old Griego will be eligible for parole when he turns 52.
While Griego didn't show much emotion at the start of the retrial, as the judge read out his sentence, he was caught from behind wiping tears from his eyes. Griego will be eligible for parole when he turns 52. Sometimes, passion could lead people to commit the most unspeakable crimes out of revenge. And even teenagers aren't left out, as students at the Chardon High School were about to find out about Thomas T.J. Lane's love life in the worst possible way.
Moments after entering the courtroom, Ohio school shooter T.J. Lane took off his shirt. Underneath was a T-shirt with the word killer handwritten on it.
On the morning of the 26th of February, 2012, 6 students were shot in the cafeteria of Chardon High School, Ohio. 3 of them ended up dead with 2 others hospitalized, one of which ended up permanently paralyzed. The perpetrator? 17-year-old sophomore Thomas T.J. Lane III. Lane was a former student of Chardon High who had switched to Lake Academy Alternative School for special students, but used the same bus as most of the victims. At around 7:30 a.m. local time, Lane stood up in the Chardon High School cafeteria and began shooting towards 5 male students at a table with a .22 caliber handgun. And as he fled while being chased by a couple of teachers, he shot at another victim, this time a female student. Lane was eventually identified and arrested by police outside the school near his car, which was parked close by. Of his 6 victims, 3 managed to survive, including 17-year-old Nick Wolczak, who was shot several times, but the other 3 weren't so lucky. According to student witnesses, Lane had something of a rivalry with one of the victims, Russell King Jr., because he had recently begun dating Lane's ex-girlfriend. Since Lane was under the age of 18 and not formally charged as an adult, he was considered by the law as a juvenile, and a detention hearing, rather than a trial, was held for him on the 28th of February 2012. Lane apparently had a history of juvenile delinquency, and after his arrest, the presiding judge allowed the release of his juvenile records to the press. The records revealed that Lane had been arrested twice in December 2009, once for assisting an assault on his uncle, and the other for committing an assault himself. Prosecutors indicated that they wanted Lane charged as an adult, and eventually on the 1st of March 2012, he was formally charged with 3 counts of aggravated murder, 2 counts of aggravated attempted murder, and 1 count of felonious assault. However, the judge postponed the decision for Lane to get a mental competency evaluation. Lane was finally indicted on all 6 charges that June, and months later, on the 26th of February 2013, the 1-year anniversary of the shootings, Lane pled guilty to the charges, with his sentencing hearing date set for the 19th of March 2013. However, on the day of his sentencing, Lane's behavior would send shockwaves throughout the court. As he entered the courtroom, he removed his dress shirt to reveal a white t-shirt which had the word killer handwritten across the front. And not only that, Lane also smiled and smirked at the judge and the victims' families throughout the hearing. Lane was sentenced to 3 consecutive life sentences without parole, but after being sentenced, Lane would once again shock the courtroom. This time, he uttered a quite graphic statement over the murder of his victims to their families, before hitting them with the F word and throwing up a middle finger to the attendees.
In Ohio, a teenager convicted of a high school shooting that killed 3 students is back in custody after daring escape overnight. T.J. Lane climbed a prison fence last night with 2 prison inmates.
The story of Thomas Lane wasn't over, however, and on the 11th of September 2014, he escaped from the Allen Correctional Institution along with 2 other inmates using a makeshift ladder. Lane was eventually captured near the woods a day later and then transferred to the Ohio State Supermax Penitentiary. Today, Lane spends his days behind bars at the Southern Ohio Maximum Security Correctional Facility and would probably be there for the rest of his life. Speaking of life sentences, this next teenager's actions were so gruesome that the courtroom was left in shock.
God! 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 God!
On the 7th of December 2018, 2 19-year-olds, Trey Ingraham and Jordan Payton, were shot and killed in an apartment at the Jade Park Apartment Homes in Daytona Beach. Payton had been shot at 6 times, while Ingraham had been shot at 4 times and their bodies abandoned. The shooter was later identified to be 19-year-old former Bethune-Cookman University student Damon Kemp, who had broken into the apartment complex that morning. Kemp, who was armed with a pistol, found his way into the apartment of his old friend Ingraham, where he occasionally used to stay before being asked to leave. He reportedly shot multiple times at Ingraham and his roommate Payton as they tried to flee before leaving them for dead. He then proceeded to break into a different apartment in the same building, but the resident managed to push him out and lock the door. Reports reveal that Daytona Beach police had received a call about the break-in after neighbors heard the gunshots. As they arrived at the scene, they met Kemp, who was still making his way out of the building. But they had no idea of the murders and only insisted that he stop walking towards them. Despite one of the police officers having his gun drawn out, a soaked Kemp continued to walk towards them and began yelling while also seeming to confess to the murder of Ingraham. The bodies of Trey Ingraham and Jordan Payton were only found about 14 hours after the gunshots were heard. But by that time, Kemp had already been arrested for the earlier break-in. A .40 caliber Glock was found in a nearby pond, believed to be where Kemp had immersed himself to wash away the blood following the shootings. Kemp's palm print was found on a holster of the murder weapon, and shell casings found in the apartment were also matched to the Glock, which reportedly belonged to Ingraham. At his first hearing following the murders, Kemp would act erratically, screaming the word God multiple times, and making faces as if to suggest that he had gone insane. Later, during his subsequent trial, Kemp's defense attorney made all sorts of claims to deny Kemp of responsibility towards his actions, despite the evidence. However, the prosecutors dismissed these claims and said that whatever mental issues he might have been suffering from weren't enough to declare legal insanity. Kemp was eventually charged with 2 counts of second-degree murder with a firearm and 1 count of armed burglary of an occupied dwelling with assault or battery, and was held at the Volusia County Branch Jail following his arrest in 2018. It took almost 5 years, but Kemp eventually had his sentencing hearing on the 29th of August, 2023. And although he didn't testify at his May 2023 trial, he did make a statement at his sentencing, which was broadcast via a Zoom stream. Kemp tried to be remorseful towards the families of the victims, claiming that he understood their pain. But he also did claim that there was no evidence against him and that he had no previous criminal case, and asked the judge for leniency in his sentencing. Kemp refused to take responsibility for his actions and tried to score pity points despite trying to cover up the crime by jumping into the pond. Ultimately, prosecutors and the victims' families asked for life sentences due to the overwhelming evidence. And Kemp, who was found guilty of all charges earlier that May, was handed 3 consecutive life sentences for his actions. Our next case comes from Florida, where a 14-year-old was the first in U.S. history to receive this sentence. In 2001, Lionel Alexander Tate found himself at the center of a tragic incident that changed his entire life in the worst way possible. At the young age of 14, Lionel received a life sentence without the possibility of parole for the death of 6-year-old Tiffany Unick, a case that made him the youngest person in the United States to be handed such a sentence. The incident unfolded on July 28, 1999, in Pembroke Park, Florida, when Lionel's mother, Kathleen Grossett Tate, was babysitting 6-year-old Tiffany Unick for the evening. Lionel, then 12, and Tiffany were watching TV after dinner when Kathleen went upstairs, unaware of what would happen next. Around 10:40 p.m., Lionel approached his mother, claiming Tiffany wasn't breathing. Lionel, weighing 170 pounds, claimed he was play wrestling with the 48-pound Tiffany and that an accident happened.
Tiffany's death could not have been a wrestling accident.
This little girl suffered over 35 injuries to her body.
But the prosecution would later paint a much darker picture. They cited 35 injuries, including a cracked skull, broken rib, lacerated liver, and hemorrhaged kidneys. According to the prosecution, these injuries are comparable to those one might sustain from falling off a 3-story building. Lionel was tried as an adult for first-degree murder despite the absence of perceived intent or premeditation. The prosecution proposed a plea deal, second-degree murder with a 3-year prison term and 10 years of probation. But Lionel chose to face the trial. The legal consequences were severe, as the judge sentenced Lionel Tate to life imprisonment. In delivering the sentence, the judge emphasized that Lionel Tate's actions were not the playful acts of a child, but rather cold, callous, and indescribably cruel.
Joel Lazarus might find a legal loophole and hand down a lighter sentence. That was not to be the case. Incarceration for your natural life. The now 14-year-old Lionel Tate was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole.
At an age when he was supposed to be playing with his friends and learning about life, then 14-year-old Lionel Tate was convinced of first-degree murder and was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole on March 9, 2001. As he was being sentenced, he sat there with empty eyes, perhaps still unaware that his life was over before it even began. Following Lionel Tate's conviction, the prosecution openly sided with Tate's plea for leniency in sentencing and even offered assistance in his appeal. This unusual collaboration drew criticism from the trial judge, who accused the prosecution of compromising the integrity of the legal system. The judge pointed out that if the prosecution believed life imprisonment was not warranted, they should not have pursued a first-degree murder charge in the first place. In January 2004, a state appeals court decided to overturn Tate's conviction on the grounds that his mental competency had not been sufficiently evaluated before the trial. This development led Tate to reconsider the same plea deal he had initially rejected. As a result, he was released on 1 year's house arrest and placed on 10 years probation. But Tate's troubles with the law were not over. On May 25, 2005, he was charged with armed burglary and battery, armed robbery, and violation of probation. The incident unfolded when Tate threatened Domino's pizza delivery man Walter Ernest Gallardo with a handgun outside a friend's apartment after placing an order. Gallardo, fearing for his safety, dropped the pizzas and fled the scene. Tate then re-entered the apartment and attacked an occupant who did not want him inside. Gallardo quickly called 911 upon reaching the Domino's store and returned to identify Tate, though no firearm was found. On March 1, 2006, Tate accepted a plea bargain, admitting to violating probation by carrying a firearm during the robbery. Despite withdrawing his guilty plea for robbery, he was sentenced to 30 years in prison on May 18, 2006 for violating probation. Florida's 4th District Court of Appeal upheld this sentence on October 24, 2007. On February 19, 2008, Tate entered a no-contest plea for the robbery charge and received a sentence of 10 years in state prison. He's currently being held in the Charlotte Correctional Institution, serving his remaining sentence. Our next case is a roller coaster you won't see coming. Get ready for a jaw-dropping twist that will leave you questioning everything. On February 21, 2011, near Tropicana Field in Florida, 46-year-old police officer David Crawford responded to a 911 call about a suspicious individual. The caller reported a man holding a brick in a backyard, who then jumped a fence, raising concerns for a potential burglary. Upon arriving at the scene, Officer Crawford spotted the individual and left his vehicle. At 10:37 p.m., Officer Donald J. Ziegler observed and reported an exchange of gunfire. Officer Ziegler then discovered Officer Crawford lying near his cruiser, having sustained multiple close-range gunshot wounds while reaching for a notepad. The assailant fled the scene, and there began a large-scale manhunt involving over 200 officers from various agencies across Tampa Bay. The search came to an end on February 22, 2011, as community tips led police to 16-year-old Nicholas Lindsay. At first, he gave conflicting statements and claimed he was innocent despite the evidence. Then, his family was brought in. Lindsay's mother, Deneen Sweet, encouraged her son to be honest as she stood by him along with his father. A police chief said Lindsay eventually broke down and confessed to discarding the firearm in a nearby creek. Despite attending school on the day of the shooting, Lindsay's educational record is marked by a concerning pattern of absenteeism, having missed 40 days during the school year. Gibbs High School's former principal, Kevin Gordon, had discussions with Lindsay about his class attendance. Both Gordon and a teacher acknowledged that, in their interactions, Lindsay consistently complied with authority. Karen Morse, one of Lindsay's teachers, described him as a typical teenager who sought attention from teachers to do his best academically. But Lindsay's behavior outside the school presented a different character. His Facebook page indicated an affiliation with a gang. On March 7, 2011, he faced an indictment by a grand jury on a first-degree murder charge, setting the stage for a legal process that would change the rest of his life. On March 23, 2012, Nicholas Lindsay was convicted for Officer Crawford's murder and was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. But the legal landscape shifted for him with the introduction of a new sentencing law, which held that the maximum sentence could only be life with a review after 25 years. In October 2013, this law played a role in upholding Nicholas Lindsay's life sentence after an appeal. On January 20th, 2017, Lindsay's attorneys sought a reduction of his sentence to 40 years. But just a week after, Lindsay received yet another life sentence. But this time, Lindsay wasn't listening to the judge in silence. He was actually grinning, the least expected move that could ever be pulled by an individual who just received a staggering life sentence, twice. The judge claimed that the sentence would undergo a review in 2036, which would mark 25 years served. As of right now, Nicholas Lindsay remains incarcerated in the Blackwater River Correctional Facility and looks like he won't be getting out anytime soon. Buckle up. You won't believe the turn our next story will take. In 2016, Jordan Clee lived in Ann Arbor with his mother, Karen. Having lost his father just 4 months after the birth, Jordan never had the opportunity to meet him, but he found a strong father figure in his grandfather, who played a crucial role in shaping Jordan's character and skills. Despite being a widow, Karen worked tirelessly to provide her son with the best possible life. Jordan ended up as a remarkably athletic and sporty guy, especially in biking and skiing. He also became one of the top players at his school in football. Alongside his athletic achievements, Jordan was also thriving academically with high grades and various school activities. But Jordan Clee's promising future was cut short on October 4th, 2016, just as he was expecting his high school graduation and looking forward to attending Michigan University. He had dreams of joining the university's football team, but these dreams were quickly shattered. Around 3 p.m. on that day, a maintenance worker on duty at Pine Lake Village made a grim discovery. While working inside the building, he went outside and found a young man lying still on the ground. He also observed a pool of blood surrounding the victim's head and identified a single gunshot wound to the middle of his forehead. The case was ruled a homicide, and it wasn't too long before the perpetrator got caught. It was 17-year-old Dante Wright. On March 5th, the courtroom atmosphere became heavy with emotion as Dante Wright openly admitted to his involvement, along with 2 other friends, in an attempted gunpoint robbery of 18-year-old Jordan Clee. According to the prosecution, the boys were affiliated with a gang. On this emotional day in court, Jordan Clee's family took the stand to share the pain and overwhelming loss she had experienced since the murder of their beloved Jordan. Her mother was struggling to hold back tears as she kept being strong for her family and for the memory of Jordan. To this heartfelt moment, Dante Wright decided to react with a grin on his face, almost as if he had zero regrets. His seemingly indifferent behavior shocked everyone in that courtroom that day, including the judge. As Wright took the stand, he seemed like he genuinely believed that he was going to get away with it.
I just want to tell y'all I'll be home soon, or I'll be Keon. I love my family.
That, of course, made it all worse. Despite Wright having already pleaded guilty to the murder of Jordan Clee, Judge Swartz decided to reconsider the initial plea deal given the teen's behavior in court. Wright's smirk only faded when the judge sentenced Wright for the second-degree murder of 23 to 50 years. Dante Wright's defense lawyer, David Goldstein, attempted to offer an explanation for his client's disturbing behavior in court. Goldstein argued that Wright was only 17 years old and that he grinned because he was afraid, not because he was proud of what he did. But the judge obviously wasn't convinced. The trial surrounding Jordan Clee's murder was a challenging and emotional process for all involved, but it played a very important role in bringing closure to Clee's family and making sure that justice was served. We now head to Massachusetts, where a math teacher met a student who had an elaborate plan to kill her.
On the shocking killing of the high school math teacher, a 14-year-old student you see there under arrest right now.
Philip Chism was only 14 and in 9th grade when he brutally murdered his 24-year-old math teacher, Colleen Ritzer, at Danvers High School, Massachusetts, on the 22nd of October, 2013. Ritzer was known to be a jovial character who was always willing to help her students with problems, and this endeared the students to her. However, it seems Chism was not one of those students because on the 22nd of October, 2013, his reaction after he was innocently asked by Ritzer to stay after school for some lessons was nothing short of horrific.
As Chism, her own student and only 14 at the time, strangled and stabbed her.
On that fateful day, Chism had stayed behind and trailed Ritzer into one of the school toilets where he attacked and then stabbed her 16 times with a box cutter. And after confirming that she was dead, he then stole her credit card and dumped her body into a garbage can, which he dragged and hid behind the school, but not before once again assaulting Ritzer's lifeless body, this time with a tree branch. Chism had planned the entire murder in advance and even brought a change of clothes as well as gloves and a mask, as he hoped to escape being spotted, even attempting to skip school the next day. However, the ordeal was captured by the school's security cameras, and Chism was caught the following morning, with his hands still bloodstained as he hadn't washed them, and he was promptly arrested after confessing to his actions later that afternoon. Police were finally able to locate Ritzer's half-naked body covered with leaves, the tree branch still lodged in her private part, and a handwritten note presumably from Chism which read, "I hate you all." Despite all the evidence labeled against him, Chism chose to plead not guilty in a November 2013 trial at a district court. However, the case was then moved to the Superior Court.
001, charging on the 22nd day of October 2013 at Danvers in the county of Essex, did assault and beat Colleen Ritzer with the intent to murder her, and by such assault and beating did kill and murder said Colleen Ritzer. We'll take it straight to this indictment. Guilty or not guilty? Not guilty. Not guilty.
Philip Chism was indicted for the aggravated rape, armed robbery, and murder of Colleen Ritzer. Massachusetts law allows for teenagers to be tried as adults, and with such a heinous crime committed, Chism, who was found guilty at a December 2015 hearing, was eventually sentenced to serve 40 years to life in prison on the 26th of February, 2016.
Philip Chism has been found guilty of brutally and murdering his 9th grade teacher when he was just 14 years old. The now 16-year-old was accused of killing 24-year-old Colleen Ritzer in October 2013 at Danvers High School in Massachusetts.
At his court showing, what Chism did shocked the entire courtroom. Despite being known to be antisocial, Chism showed a very chilling demeanor in the court. One time he bragged about becoming the teacher with his actions, and on several occasions had to be removed from the courtroom due to his behavior. Even after he received his life sentence, his face showed no real sign of emotion, as he was proven to have planned the murder for weeks. Ritzer's grieving parents were also in the courtroom and could not hide their anguish at his actions. As Chism was only 16 at the time of sentencing, he was eligible for parole after 38 years, having already served 2 of his sentences. This was despite the wishes of Ritzer's parents, who pleaded for a harsher sentence.
This court is constitutionally obligated to set a parole date no more than 25 years for her murder. While Colleen Ritzer's rape and murder were inextricably intertwined, this court may not punish the defendant with more prison time for the than justice demands for the purposes of avoiding constitutional limitations imposed by our Massachusetts Declaration of Rights.
However, one of the major talking points of the verdict was the possibility that Chism ends up being rehabilitated at an earlier date, although relatives of the victim would hope this wouldn't be the case here. Now, let's head to Milwaukee, where tension reaches its peak as Shawnell Jackson awaited his verdict.
Later, his family and the public would be shocked to discover that Jackson's uncle had turned him into the police.
On the 6th of July, 2009, Nathan Potter, a 21-year-old film student at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, was shot and killed in an attempted robbery while walking near his River West apartment. There were 2 suspects in his murder, 19-year-old Derek J. Thomas, and the actual man who pulled the trigger, 18-year-old Shawnell Jackson. And both men were also alleged to have shot and injured another man about 12 hours later. Witnesses were able to identify Jackson from a group of photos, and evidence from both incidents suggested that the attacker had used the same .45 caliber handgun. Investigators were also able to find out about Jackson's accomplice, Thomas, who had been acting as a lookout. Both men were eventually caught about a month later, arrested and charged for their respective crimes before being detained. During a February 2010 hearing, the young Jackson's expression showed neither remorse nor sorrow over his actions, although he did eventually read out an apology. The father of the victim, John Potter, called his actions evil and petitioned the judge to give him a befitting sentence. Potter's mother also reacted to the situation, saying that Jackson didn't deserve any leniency from the court. Jackson was eventually convicted of his crimes, and on the 16th of April, 2010, he was handed a life sentence without the possibility of parole at the sentencing hearing. He was also handed 5 years for attempted robbery and 5 years for the non-fatal shooting which occurred on the same day. And the way he reacted shocked everyone in the courtroom. Nevertheless, Jackson still had the audacity to smirk at his victim's family as he was escorted out of the courtroom. Jackson's accomplice, Thomas, was handed a 12-year sentence for his role in the death of Nathan Potter, as well as the subsequent non-fatal shooting. Following the verdict, Jackson's family began to hurl insults directed at Potter's family, which more or less confirmed that he wasn't always influenced by the right people. But ultimately, he will have more than enough time behind bars to think about his crime as he spends the rest of his life in jail. If you thought these male teens were volatile, you need to see these angry Karens reacting to life sentences.